And we're off. Just so you all know, we're recording so that people who can't join can have a listen and comment later. So, Lukas, we originally thought this dialogue would be about sacred masculinity, but you said no, it's actually about settler trauma. That's your main expertise. Why? What brought that to you?
Well, I think because when I think about a lot of the problems and whatnot that we associate with masculinity, over time I sort of began to realize that that's not the root of the problems. It's more of a symptom. So, we hear sort of phrases thrown around like toxic masculinity or whatever. And I've come to refer to it more as overwhelmed masculinity. So then the question is, why is our masculine side, whether we are men or women biologically, why is our masculine side overwhelmed? And that's sort of this path that led me towards thinking and talking about this idea of settler trauma.
So, you know that saying that when you're a fish and you're in the water, you can't see the water you're in, right? But then you started traveling overseas and lived overseas, in your 20s and early 30s. And then you moved back to Australia, and watching you, it was just like, pow, all of a sudden, all this stuff became clear to you. Do you want to talk about what that was like, that moment of realization coming back here with those new eyes?
So for me, I think it was a process of identifying a hole or a deficiency or some feeling of lack. And the way I went about trying to explore and unpack, what that hole was. And so the process of moving overseas and then moving back, I guess, was one of the ways in which I sort of started to see, what that hole was. And, it's the hardest part really is you feel that pain, you feel that lack before you have any sense of what you might do or how you might go about trying to heal it. So, I went on this journey of sort of understanding that a lot of the solidity that I thought I felt in my being, and that includes my identity, my cultural and ethnic identity, and even my racial identity, was actually not very solid at all. I have this sort of thing where I joke around where I'm like, I've really only spent a couple of years since adolescence feeling remotely solid, but yet I held that up as being that's the norm. And the rest of the time when I was just struggling all the time as being like the aberration. But it's like, no, the time when I was feeling solid was actually the aberration. And for reasons that, involved a lot of trickery and things like that. So coming back to Australia was almost like the closing of a long loop. And, the travel component to that was like a metaphor for the deeper sort of internal journey I was going on, being shown all these things about myself that I thought were built on solid ground, but were actually built on extremely flimsy ground. And then so coming back to Australia gave me the opportunity to start to explore some of the wider cultural contexts for what that flimsy structure actually is and where it might have been rooted in.
So when you think about your roots, talk to me about that. Where do you feel rooted?
Yeah, this is in a sense the heart of where I'm at now in terms of thinking about this, because I feel rooted in this it's funny I say rooted because that's such a classic Aussie slang to mean broken, which is funny. You call something rooted, it's rooted, mate. It means it's broken. Right. So it's funny that you said that. So I'm rooted in my rootedness because of the fact that it's really schizophrenic. And I didn't really know that until I went back to Europe for the first time and kind of looked out upon, this verdant green, the kind of green that, you might find it in sort of tropical Australian plants and stuff. But for the most part, there's a certain green that to the Australian continent that is just a different kind of verdant. Like you know, what we think of as fertile in Australia and fertile in Europe is just sort of different. It rains a lot in Europe. And I went back there and I was like, oh, I'm home, you know? But the sad part about that was that, you know, it was a feeling of home, but it was so clearly not my home at the same time. And it's like, okay, that is super sad that I have this double feeling of being home, but also clearly not home. And so then it wasn't until I came back to Australia and it was like understanding, okay, what it is that makes me feel, you know, somewhat rooted here, being born here and of my body literally being made here, but then also starting to explore what those connections were to the old countries and why they were still so strong, even after on one side of my family being, you know, 7th generation Australian.
So you were, when you think back about the old country and the settler trauma, you know, why did you understand that your people ended up on this colonizing journey of coming here? You were really impacted by an essay called Roots Deeper Than Whiteness by an American Anglo man called David Dean. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what that helped you understand of your like farther back history of your people?
Yeah, so Roots Deeper Than Whiteness came at it from the American perspective, but it was really about what was happening in Europe at the time of colonization. So it's so easy when you are in the new world, inverted commas. So when you're in Australia, oh, thank you, Max. There it is. There's the link. When you're in Australia or America, the mess we've made through colonization and the people we've harmed, including ourselves, is just such a huge mess. I mean, in America, they have slavery, which is another level. I mean, I know we had some slavery here, but theirs is obviously massive. That, you know, we tend to suffer from this thing that I call the once there was syndrome. So when there's something really shitty that we don't like, we sort of start the story there. So it's like once there was patriarchy, once there was colonialism. And sure, if you're an Aboriginal Australian, a lot of the challenges you deal with today definitely have that story of once there was colonialism, like once these people showed up. But from the settler perspective, that's just not at all the case. Like we had a story
before that.
Yeah. So that's what Roots Deeper Than Whiteness started to unpack, that actually there were these conditions in Europe that led to the explosion of people out of Europe and a lot of the behaviors that came after that. And, you know, so what it really talks about is this idea of ethnicity. And so, you know, we all have an ethnicity that doesn't just mean white or even European. It's a more nuanced sense of belonging and whatnot that sort of gets erased by colonialism. And so, you know, that's what I just enjoyed about that article, that it was actually unpacking things like capitalism. And, you know, in Britain, they had something called the Enclosure movement, which was this process of essentially putting fences around what was once the common land, even though I know that there was this complicated relationship between the feudal system and the commoners, or even the serfs, which were like sort of slaves in some parts of Europe. It was still this sense of reciprocity, as corrupt as that may have been.
It was still land everyone was allowed to access, forage, hunt, etc.
And so Enclosure was the commercialization of that land, for want of a better way of describing it, by putting a fence around it and sort of saying this is privately owned and therefore privately tradable. And that includes cash cropping and the way in which, you know, the commoners became just inputs in cash cropping. And so that created a significant movement of people along with the Industrial Revolution from rural life to city life. And the kind of city life, like when I think about European cities in like the 17th and 18th century, they're probably up there with some of the worst environments humans have ever created. Like just the most
lots of disease.
Disease-ridden, poverty, people absolutely traumatized from that process of being kicked off their lands. And then,
barely surviving in these cities.
That's right.
The whole family, kids, everybody working to survive. Yeah.
And, one of the cruel ironies is that one of the ways that the gentry tried to square the inhumanity of that system was to sort of talk about this idea of deficiency almost they didn't have they didn't know genes at the time, but this idea that certain people carried with them an almost innate deficiency that needed to be corrected or even excised, like even cut out of the country like it was a cancer. And so
rather than taking responsibility for the conditions, can you talk a bit about that and how that led to what David Dean calls the bribe of whiteness, and how those Indigenous sovereign identities and clan structures and kinship groups, which had already been broken down by the church, which is a longer history, but there was more of that connection at that time, right? And then this mass movement of people came in, a lot of loss of cultural identity, connection to country, and then that bribe of whiteness was all this big, nasty soup.
Right. I mean, that's funny with this conversation. The hardest part is like how far back to go in talking about it. And there's really, you can go all the way back to Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent and the beginnings of complex agriculture to really understand. For me, there's this throughput of greed, that this idea of being above the land and being able to control the land, and greed, or a certain wanting of control, I guess, of life's challenges, sitting at the root of it. So colonization was this way of exporting that way of being overseas and sort of getting access to these vast natural resources. And I think this is where the Australian story and the American story sort of diverges a little bit. America, from the very beginning, I think the economic aspect of it was so much stronger. So an anecdote I actually heard from a podcast for the first time. I think it's actually quite a famous anecdote, but I had never heard of it. But it was a podcast called Seeing White, the first few episodes of which I would really, really recommend to anybody. It basically talked about how in the early days of the United States colonies, or the American colonies at the time, there wasn't this idea of black and white. What you had were people of different ethnicities, some of whom had dark skin. And in the early days, you had a lot of indentured servitude and serfs, literally people who were, they were slaves, except they had conditions attached to it that they could, there was a sentence that they could complete.
They could work their way out.
They could work their way out of it. And that applied to the people of different ethnicities. And what happened was 3 of these escaped, I think, from the Jamestown colony, one of whom was black and 2 of whom were what we would now call white people. And somebody came up with the idea that, well, because we can so easily differentiate by skin color, the punishment that was given to the person with dark skin was lifetime servitude. And so a lot of that was around unrest. At that time, the actual majority of the indentured servitudes people in indentured servitude had white skin.
Yeah.
So making sure that they didn't revolt and rebel, and there's situations where people actually went off to live with the Native Americans.
Because that felt more familiar to them. Yeah.
We're talking about a time when people had been living an agricultural lifestyle up until very recently. So the way the Native Americans living in some ways was actually more familiar.
Yeah.
And so maintaining control over those people, the classic divide and conquer strategy was sort of, all right, the person with the dark skin, we're going to give that person a much harsher sentence for escaping. And he was given lifetime servitude. And then over a series of legal decisions, basically, this institution of chattel slavery was created. And so in order to maintain that structure, you had to have a really strong dividing boundary between the people of the different skin types. And so there you had black and white created. And for me, that's, in the Australian context, those ideas just made it so much easier to apply thinking such as terra nullius and whatnot, because it meant that, you know, no matter how poorly you were treating a convict or a settler, there was always someone underneath them that, you know, the dehumanizing could flow downwards, and there was always someone beneath them that, you know, they weren't going to band together and overthrow the controlling elite. So
there's this feeling that you may have been kicked out of your country and brought here as an indentured servant, but you're not the absolute bottom of the heap. So you should still be part of that system.
Well, I mean, in Australia, you know, prosperity in an economic sense was really sort of unexpected. And when it happened, the demand for land and productivity was so high that convicts were being given huge amounts of land to work when they finished their sentence, to the point where there were actually directions from England sent to Australia that they needed to be harsher to the convicts, because convicts were writing back home to their families and saying, hey, it's really not that bad. Just steal a loaf of bread and get shipped to Australia. It's amazing.
Right.
But critical to that was this idea of the expanding frontier. And so the more wild the land was, the more likely it was to be given to an ex-convict to sort of, you know, you go to war against the Indigenous people. So you had this battle for life being fought between newly freed convicts and Indigenous people. And then closer to the center of the colony, you had the higher ups who didn't even have to really participate in that. They knew what was going on.
They let other people do the dirty work.
Right.
Let's talk about that, because you have this idea that you call the bully victim, right? So you sent me this stuff a while ago. Research into bullying shows that if you were bullied, like you were in that victim role, or if you were the bully, you were in the offender role, that it actually is a lot easier for people to heal if they've just done one or experienced one side of that issue.
Right.
But if you're somebody who both was bullied and you bullied somebody else, which you call the bully victim, it seems to take a lot longer for people to heal and unpack that complication. And that's how you refer to your people here, right?
Right. We're basically a nation of bully victims.
Talk about that.
So, you know, what's really ironic, if you read the personal stories, even of the military officers and sort of senior people who came to Australia, they were all outcasts from their own families. Like even the aristocrats, inverted commas, the only reason they ended up in Australia at that time was because they themselves were considered weird or outcasts, or they had gambling debts and all that sort of stuff.
They were the rejects.
Yeah, so it's like through and through, that bully victim notion is almost like a founding thing in the colonial Australian story.
So feeling rejected by these people that are part of your tribe, and then coming here and then waging that trauma on the Indigenous people here.
Right. So I mean, the best bullies, when I say the best bullies, you know, there's always this sense that if you implant into somebody the idea that their pain and suffering can be solved by taking it out on another, you know, that's like a very powerful force to be unleashed. And so, you know, I think you could probably find even within Europe that sort of behavior had been going on for a while, but colonialism just supercharged it. I mean, because in Australia, you know, that was so much of our story.
Well, you still talk about that today. I mean, we might look at something in the news and you just feel all this pain, and we talk about, you know, sovereignty and governance, and you just look around and you say, like, my people are really lost. Like, we're not sovereigns of this land. What are we doing?
Right. I'm really glad we got to this issue of sovereignty, because a good example of my transformation is looking at particularly the First World War. So, you know, the First World War happened 14 years after Australia claimed in its own minds a certain sense of sovereignty with federation. So officially under the law, we were no longer a colony. We were this supposedly sovereign nation that had independence.
Yeah.
And then this massive intrafamilial squabble breaks out in Europe where, you know, the great weapons that had been developed in like the industrial age got to be tested on a massive scale.
Mm.
And the way in which Australians went to fight in that conflict, despite the fact that those European institutions hadn't actually been kind to them.
Mm.
Like, we may have in our own minds made a good fist of it in Australia, but that wasn't because people in Europe really gave a shit about us. It was just because, you know, we were able to just abuse this place so effectively. So we go off to war and die in these huge numbers, and that includes, you know, 30% of Anglo-Celtic Australians, as I call what is the classic white Aussie, are from Irish background.
Yeah.
And so the Irish are sort of the most intense version of that, signing up to go to war to fight for an abusive parent is what I think of that war. And it's just such a cultural blind spot in Australia, potentially even increasingly so. You know, that it makes me realize, to me, so I've been thinking a lot about, I'll segue into what I've really been chomping at the bit to talk about.
Yeah.
It's this idea of sovereignty. So the pandemic has, for me, really shined a light on exactly what sovereignty means in Australia. And so we have state and federal governments in Australia. And like a lot of places in the world, federal politics tends to suck up a lot of attention because people sort of feel like it controls or influences the agenda on some of these big ticket ideological issues, right? But when you think about key aspects of what it means to be in a free society, like freedom of movement, literally, where can you go? And if you're not free, who will come and arrest you and detain you and stop your freedom? It's that kind of sovereign power actually rests with the states in Australia.
And where does that flow structurally from that, you know?
Well, that's what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
So it's funny, we have this thing called the Australian coat of arms, which has an emu and a kangaroo on it. And Valerie, you were telling me that this Aboriginal man from the Northern Territory was saying how, well, it's a good thing that energetically we have those Australian animals on there.
He felt like it was a positive thing, that had penetrated the psyche of the colonizers,
And I can see where he's coming from with that, but for me, it's also a little bit of a trick, because if we think about the states as being where real sovereign power lies, like, so the other one I didn't mention is land. The absolute vast majority of land is controlled by the states in Australia. If you buy title to a land in Australia, it is a state body that gives you that title. All of the Crown land in Australia is state land. The federal government has very little land under its direct control. It has the ACT, it has defence lands, and then it has extra control over the territories, like Northern Territory. But the actual states control the majority of the land. So we have this coat of arms that feels very sort of Australian and you know, and Indigenous. Those are Indigenous animals. But then you look at where real power lies, and there's crowns all over the place. New South Wales Police has got a crown on it. Department that will issue you, if you get a title deed, it'll have a crown on it. If you are in a court of law,
it's the crown versus somebody.
It is literally the crown versus your name. And the prosecutor doesn't even have a name. They'll be called Miss Crown. And so I started to sort of delve into that a little bit. And actually, in the Australian framework, the governors of the states report directly to the Queen. So sovereignty flows from the Queen to the governor of the states, to the governments of the states. And Australia's constitution doesn't actually have a lot of information in it about individual rights and things like that. It is more than anything a document that just explains exactly what limited pieces of sovereignty those states cede to
this
the Crown.
Yeah.
So this is really a long-winded way of talking about Australia's massive blind spots when it comes to sovereignty, because a lot of people would say, oh, who cares? You know, what does it matter if all of the emblems and things in state governments have crowns on them. Well, what I started to really think about was this idea that in the Queen, her power comes from God. That's how it is. It's literally the God flows from the Queen. So you've got this.
She's like the Pope. She's the head of the Anglican Church.
Right.
And therefore she has that spiritual power to rule.
Right.
Yeah.
So it goes from the Queen, so God, to the Queen, to the governor of a state of Australia,
yeah,
to the government.
Yes.
And there has actually been instances where a governor sacked a state government, the famous one in the Great Depression. So for me, that's a really deep power, because it literally means when you step out of your house to go anywhere, or you want to do anything, you want to have any kind of freedom of movement of whatever, there is literally a spiritual connection back to that sovereign in another country.
Which is why, to me, coming from growing up in the US, Australia still feels like a colony.
Right. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But for me, that blind spot just shows the depth to which our trauma actually masks, for a lot of people, the implications of that. Because it means that, because we don't talk about it, I mean, some people talk about it, I guess, when there's like a royal wedding or something, but, we just do all of these things almost unconsciously. And then we wonder why, Aboriginal people react so strongly to that stuff. Like the idea that the power rests with the Queen and that kind of thing. It's like, no wonder those institutions feel abusive.
But people see through it. I remember we were recently watching this documentary about the Namatjira family, right? And they were some of Albert's ancestors going to meet the Queen, and they were asking them, what do you want to talk to her about?
Right.
And he said, I want her to give me some of my land to live on.
Yeah.
I want her to give me permission to live on my own land, because this poor man was homeless.
Right.
He goes and brings the Queen a painting and says that to her.
Right.
And she just smiles. What a lovely painting, right?
Right.
Oh.
I mean, it's just an example of what you're saying. Like, the fish in the water can't see the water.
Yeah.
And it's like, the idea that there's this deep spiritual power over us, because you imagine that those crowns sit on top of the New South Wales Police. It sits on top.
Yes.
And it's easy to write that off as just, oh, well, what does that matter pragmatically? But I guess when I've come to know myself and start to explore my wounds, I think that power over is a good segue into sort of the next aspect of settler trauma I wanted to talk about, which is like, what does it mean when your whole relationship to power and God and that kind of thing, spirituality is not only invisible to you, it's not only on the other side of the world, but it's all top down.
Yeah.
And not bottom up.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because for me, when I look at Australia, I think that madness must be part of the way that people can literally, destroy sacred sites here and chop all the trees down here and mine here in order to send it overseas. And it's like you're destroying your own space, because in their minds, they're still serving this crown and this land all the way over there. It's like they're still identifying with being elsewhere.
That's right. Because on some spiritual level, we don't feel it as our space. We feel it as this resource to be used, because our spiritual homeland is still overseas, because we haven't grieved that loss. We maintain these deep connections over there, and then we wonder why we treat the place so badly. And to me, that's just a thread, again, to circle back to this idea of like greed being the thread. I think that, I call it the fix-it brain, the engineering brain. It's like basically when you're struggling and that voice comes into your head throwing solutions at you. I think of that as being a very patriarchal voice. Like, that's your overwhelmed masculine. And you can see that in all of us have it to some degree or another if we've grown up in a culture like this. That's your overwhelmed masculine. So we're this country of people who know only this top-down, overwhelmed feeling of sovereignty.
Yeah.
And that is basically a perpetuation of a trauma that could be hundreds of years, of thousands of years in the making. And, you know, this is where Aboriginal people are giving us such a beautiful gift in their sacrifice, because for them, this wound is so new and raw that it's so obvious. It's like this sore that's just awful, and you can see it everywhere.
But a lot of people can't make sense of it, right? Like that Warlpiri man who, when I met him last year, said to me, why doesn't everybody who's moving here realize that they need to be spiritually adopted by us? Like, how I don't even understand how they don't see that.
Right. Well, I mean, it's funny. So I stepped on a sea urchin a few weeks ago, and the skin on the bottom of your foot, it turns out, that I learned, grows really, really fast. And I guess that makes sense in, you know, in a situation where, you know, you need to continue the hunt or whatever, unless you're going to die. So you need that skin to grow. But I had this bit of sea urchin and pus and all this gross stuff literally covered over by skin to the point that you couldn't even see it anymore.
No, but you felt something.
I felt something when I tuned into it, but it was easily ignored. And then, you know, we cut into it and it's like, boom, this explosion. So I think that's how. It's that the wound has been grown over. But I think that literally, you want to talk about the bribe of whiteness, that's like encouraging that wound to grow over.
And to collectively ignore, because we talk about this sometimes, right? How a lot of people seem to, instead of being grounded in the earth, they're like a cloud hovering above the earth. But because there's so many of them, they seem to just cling and reinforce. And from the settler trauma perspective, it makes sense that when you arrive in a new land, you don't know what you can eat there. You don't know where you can get clean water. Like, how are you going to survive if you don't all like really hover and stick together and learn how to be there, right? But it's like, you've been here now for a number of years, and if you'd shown up and been able to show respect to the Indigenous peoples, you might be on a very different journey.
Well,
but in any case, you've been here long enough now. Why are you still in that clinging phase?
Well, I mean, to begin with, there's just too many stories to name of settlers who would have died if they weren't just helped by the Aboriginal people.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's that.
That generosity, yeah.
But no, for me, the answer to that question is just that it's powerful. That top-down patriarchal energy, particularly in the physical, so rather than the invisible, like the symbolism of the womb, the invisible.
Yeah.
It's just powerful. I mean, the fact of the matter is Australia feeds 26 million people, and then however many, like something like 60% of our agriculture gets exported overseas. I mean, whatever way you want to look at it, that's powerful.
Something's working for people.
You know, in this way of, it's a domination.
We're surviving.
It's an oppression, but it's power.
But when you talk about sovereignty flowing from the Queen, I mean, the origin of the Queen and her family, they're not indigenous to Britain anyway. I mean, they came in through the Norman conquest, which was people from mainland Europe coming in and overpowering people in the British Isles. So even that root of that sovereignty, I mean, that's set up through oppression anyway.
Right. I mean, that's one of the, I think if you look at feudal Europe and this idea of greed, and we've talked about greed as being almost like this communicable disease, like a virus. Yeah. I think that the aristocrats probably had more of that virus. They were carrying a higher viral load of the greed virus. And so they would just chop and change and switch sovereignty all over the place. And peasants were just, you know, living a reasonably subsistence lifestyle and fending for themselves and everything, but sort of
weathering the storms of that behavior. Yeah.
I mean, the church obviously the church was the connective tissue between the top and the bottom. The church went all the way down to the people. And that was for sure a way of giving power. But I think that was one of the changes that happened with post-industrialization and colonialization, is that the bribe needed to be extended to a wider and a wider and a wider group of people. To the point now where I think capitalism is stopped even giving a shit about ethnicity now, and the bribe is whoever wants to take it.
Whoever play the game.
Yeah, whoever is willing to play that top-down game and be bribed by that power. It's like that patriarchal, overwhelmed masculine is just, it's like a power elixir.
So what helps you when you're processing that? And I mean, what's helped you even see through a lot of that?
Pain and suffering in the extreme. So for whatever reason, and meeting you was part of this, obviously, but I managed to set up my life in such a way where even that bribe was rejecting. So it was like, I get to America and I'm like, I'm ready for my bribe now. And they were like, no, you're going to be one of the people sacrificed. Because it's like in this society, you think about people in jail, you think about Indigenous people, you think about unemployed people. You need to have people who are suffering.
They're wasted. In
order to show everybody else what they don't want to be.
Yeah.
That's the carrot and the stick of it, and it's so strong in Australia. Once you start to look for it, you'll see it everywhere in Australia.
Yeah.
We have such a carrot and stick society. You know, it's like if you do, you know, it's fight well and you will be rewarded with the colonial patriarchal dream. Fight poorly and we will beat you and we will, you know, make you suffer. So for whatever reason, I managed to engineer my life in such a way where I was given that rejection. And it was sort of like, all right, you're going to be in that shit heap. And so then the question was, did I want to fight like hell to climb back up, to put myself back into that oppressive position? Or did I want to try and see through some stuff and do things a little differently? Now, I'm not going to lie. There are times when I flailed around. Like even when we moved to Australia, take my old career as being symbolic of that way of being. I like put in applications for the old jobs. I'm like, I can't handle it anymore. This transition is killing me. I need to go back. And even then, I was still being told, no.
Yeah.
So on some level, it was like to claim any kind of sort of like personal like credit for my journey is sort of impossible. It's sort of like I've flowed into this sense where this is necessary for my survival to heal this settler wound.
Do you want to relate that to some Indigenous healing experiences you had in Peru and doing work with that ayahuasca plant? Do you see that as part of this?
Briefly, but I think I can talk more about it in Australian context.
Yeah.
So that's the starting point. I have to do this work.
That became really clear to you.
So the wound, once you cut open the wound and you see that massive infection that used to be covered over by skin, it's quite difficult to go back because you're like, oh crap, like I have to do this. And I think for me, that's the key. And where I would, you know, say to people, like, there is a way that colonial Australians can flow into seeing, for example, healing our relationship with Indigenous people, recognizing Indigenous sovereignty and, you know, Indigenous expertise even. When that can flow when we realize that we absolutely need it, which is different from, oh, we better share some of the colonial booty with the people we stole it from.
Or we feel ashamed. That shame power.
We've stolen all this shit. We better share some of it.
They're shaming us, and rightfully so.
Right. That's one way we can do it.
Yeah.
But another way to do it is to actually understand that we need to do it to survive in any kind of healthy way. And so that is the long journey. So yes, I did have some medicine in the jungle, which sort of blew me open. I mean, that you could have almost called that cutting away some of that scar tissue that was covering my wounds, like a powerful psychedelic that is like a torpedo to the brain, and it just peels away your scar tissue. And actually, there's a lot of people who go through some kind of spiritual shift like that, and they actually suffer more because, like I said at the very beginning, it's like seeing the wound is only the first part. You can be totally overwhelmed and crushed by it once you see it. Then the question is like, holy shit, what do I do differently? And so for me, a more powerful experience was coming down to Narooma here on the South Coast, which was where my first ancestor from the UK came to Australia. And
7 generations
He
ago,
was in the timber business, right? So you can go to this place called Ringland Point, the Ringland Estate.
Ringland Bay.
Ringland
Drive, Ringland
and
Walk, yeah.
It's so clearly like new growth timber because all the tree trunks are the exact same size.
Yeah.
So you know that, all right, my fucking ancestor cut down all these trees.
Yeah.
And then you go to the place where his first wife was buried. And to me, it just felt like an overwhelmingly sad place. You know, talking about settler trauma, that's just a super simple example. Here's a woman, she's moved to Australia, she's set up in this isolated place, there's no community, while her husband's busy with his overwhelmed masculine trying to make a fortune, right? Trying to become prosperous, and she died. And
just feeling like really isolated and ungrounded, and yeah.
So I started to sort of feel to myself like grounding here is what I need.
And we went to visit Gulaga, which is the sacred mother mountain near Narooma. Yeah.
So there's two sides of it. One is just humbly asking Indigenous guides when they can be found for help. You know, just humbly saying, you know, I want to ground here. You have this continuous cultural connection with the land.
Would you please share
something? Would you please help?
Yeah.
But this is sort of a more sensitive thing to say in sort of Australia's political climate. But there are times, I think, when, as a colonist, which is how I identify, you have to be willing to just, when you can't find Indigenous guides, just go and do your own work with the land.
Start connecting with the land.
And obviously, you know, I'll keep looking here on the South Coast and try and find the ability to mix with people guides as well, because obviously what I can do by myself is limited. Yeah. But it's as simple as, okay, here is what is the mountain that is at the center of the Indigenous cosmology story down here.
And very powerful energy.
Yeah, and even a lot of the, you know, when you go online and you see a lot of the tour businesses set up by Indigenous people to go up the mountain, like there's a bit of a capitalist feeling there, which I understand. But at the same time, it's like, all right, is that really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about grounding? And so
it's people surviving.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I thought, well, no, we've just been backing ourselves to form a connection to the land here in some way, and just to begin vibrating in a different way. And it's almost like once you recognize that this is a need and just start to open yourself to it, things that you might have thought as being trivial, you know, like, oh, the land's beautiful. Oh, you go on a bushwalk, but it's like, what about doing ceremony? I mean, it's like the classic Christian tactic in Europe was to say, no, ceremony takes place
within
these four walls. Yeah. Never mind that there used to be a sacred tree there. Never mind that there used to be sacred mountains, and that the land itself had this sacred aspect to it.
And all these beautiful stories and spirits.
Yeah. So you literally have colonists who live in what could be their church. And the thing is, it wouldn't even have to be an either or. You could connect to your sky god, which is what I see as the Christian Yahweh patriarchal god. You could connect to the sky god, and there's an Indigenous sky god too called Bayami. But that's up here. Like, what to do to actually feel that connection up here,
that unique groundedness of this place, this moment.
Right. And I feel like such a babe in the woods, and rightly so, because we're talking about generations of work not done by my Australian ancestors, never mind how many generations
before that,
but even just opening myself to it. And so, you know, for me, one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is, how do I start to renounce state sovereignty? Like, I went on this drive all around the back of Narooma, and I didn't count them, but there were literally hundreds and hundreds of these ugly signs. Keep out, private property, fuck off. And I started to think to myself, like, when you get title to land,
you are entitled.
You are entitled, but that's the same language as when the Queen anoints people like lords and earls and that kind of thing.
You are a little lord of this. You are a little lord of that.
private property ownership in Australia is literally you receiving a little piece of aristocracy from the Queen of England through the governor to whatever government department in New South Wales will give you the title. So for me, that's been important to actually say, you know what, I don't want to be given title to land by a faraway sovereign.
That's not how you see sovereignty.
No.
Yeah.
And that's going to create a lot of struggle for me in our lives, because it means you have to rent and all this shit. But it's like, no, I don't want title.
But it's an important renunciation, right? So, I mean, your ancestors and even your parents, right? Everyone else in your family is surviving in this structure by owning land.
Yeah.
And they've been trying to bribe you to go down that path. And it's a real renunciation for you to go, no, given my role and my history and my colonial background, that is not the right thing for me to do.
Right. It isn't. And it involves doing a lot of work in the shadow, in the death. Because the thing is, what I've learned about my own mental health journey when I've been doing a lot of this renouncing, some of it forced. Like I said, I'm not going to claim I've just strode out in front of everything. Like a lot of the time it sort of seemed to be happening to me rather than me making it happen.
Yeah.
But it's a death of sorts. Because a lot of the way I behave is a bit ugly when I'm feeling really stressed and strained. And so people aren't necessarily, when you start to go down this path, aren't necessarily going to validate you, because that's the thing. You've got this deep wound, if you're like me, and you've got that settler trauma wound. You've got this deep wound. When you start to feel stress, that wound is going to become inflamed.
And you trigger it in everyone else, and they're suppressing it.
And how you behave when you're inflamed is not necessarily going to be pretty. And people are going to try and punish you more because of that.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's what Aboriginal people go through basically every day of their lives. This sense of like, this is not my sovereignty. This is not my country. But the more this idea, oh, well, they're acting out. And it's like, yeah, because we are literally making them sick.
Yes.
And then the way the structure is set up is that you can never rely on getting more help the sicker you get in Australia. Because especially as men, I think, that trauma tends to come out of us in very destructive ways, and the system is just going to be harder and harder and harder and harder on you. So for me, I've been trying to walk towards that by saying, all right, I want to do it myself then. Rather than waiting for the system to kill me, what is some stuff around death that
release some of that fear of yourself?
Yeah. You know, rather than waiting for me to just die like my first ancestor, unfortunately, I've been having a lot of, over this time, I've had suicidal stuff come up. Like, it's been very, very dark stuff.
Psychically, yeah.
Emotionally. But where I can start to feel the changes creeping in is in the land itself. And, you know, and that some of that's really painful, because you go to places where the land has been desecrated.
Yeah, and you really feel
Oh, my God. And so, again, it's not a fun journey, but why would it be? Because how we ended up here was so shitty and messy.
Yeah.
I think that's
a good.
Yeah, I'm feeling doneness now, actually.
Yeah, that's good to end on. I was just gonna say there's a Frisian proverb that translates to death rather than slavery, which is something I go back to as well.
Right.
If I'm choosing between those, I'd rather maintain integrity and walk towards death than walk into slavery.
Right.
Knowingly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody who's been part of this, did anybody want to share a perspective or open that up?
Yeah, we got 4 minutes or however long we need.
Yeah. Hi there.
Hey. So fascinating stuff. Y'all did a wonderful job. Luke, I really appreciate the work that you've done to connect all those dots. And, you know, I've been participating in a group that is exploring how to address things like racism and the colonization of land that was inhabited by Native Americans and that type of stuff. And you know, what's y'all's perspective on, you know, how to restore land to people who really didn't have a concept of ownership of the land?
That's a good question, Randy. And what's coming to me really strongly is it has to start internal. So I said about that patriarchal fix-it voice in your head that wants to respond to pain with a controlling sort of engineering mindset, like here is the solution, here is the logical steps that you must take to feel better, to fix yourself. What I'm realizing is that as long as that's my programming, anything I try to do will be acting out of that programming. And in a sense, perpetuating those wounds. Yeah. So that would be my answer to that question, is it needs to flow in a way. That there might be a path, but I feel like we have to flow there. And I know that that's really unsatisfying in a world that has so many gaping wounds. But, you know, I haven't gone to Black Lives Matter rallies. Why? Well, it's not because of Black people. It's because of white people. I just feel this oppressive fix-it energy driven by all this guilt and all this suffering. But to me, it's just another version of that settler trauma coming out. So, you know, I'm not saying that there's not a tremendous amount of heart in those conversations that you're having, Randy. I always feel your heart, mate. But for me, it's when you can show up and connect with flow, and that flow coming out of the land is one of that. It's that maternal flow. You'll just find yourself saying things and doing things that feel healthy. And that's very unsatisfying to that patriarchal voice. But, you know, I think there's a solution, but it's hiding in the invisible, not waiting for us to decipher it in the visible.
It's that sense of the more we're grounded in ourselves and being authentic, then what needs to happen flows, and we keep renouncing some of these structures we're part of.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a good example. Sell your land. Don't own land. But then the thing is that that's going to be super painful, and you might be occupied with your own shit. Yeah. And feel like you're not doing anything to contribute to these societal problems. But for me, if you're embodying something different and then you go out into the world with that, everybody will notice. And I know you don't own land, Randy, as far as I know, but for a lot of people, like we were listening to this show about this billionaire who's like spending all this money in America to work against inequality, but he's still a billionaire. Yeah. You know?
He still jet sets around to his island.
We applaud billionaires who had 10 billion and they give away 9 billion of it and retain $1 billion. Oh, wow, how generous of you. It's like, yeah, but what is the wound that would make somebody think that they need to hold on to $1 billion? Yeah. I mean, so.
Yeah. That's a good note to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for that comment and question, Randy. Thank you everyone for joining, and this will be posted on Facebook and YouTube after, if you know someone else who might want to listen and join the conversation in the ether. And hopefully we will see you Friday for the next one with Sarah Hudson on Weaving Knowledges. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.